We're going to take a look at the gram-positive bacteria in this video. Looking at the evolutionary tree, we're going to divide the gram-positive bacteria into two different groups. We've got the high GNC gram-positive bacteria and then the low GNC gram-positive bacteria. And what's different between them is just the amount of G's and C's that they have in their DNA. The phylum name for the high GNC gram-positive bacteria is Actinobacterium, and the phylum name for the low GNC gram-positive bacteria is Firmicutes. You don't have to memorize those names or know which one's high or low GNC, or even know like which gram-positive bacteria are in which phylum, or even which of these are gram-positive. So I'm not going to ask you that at all. I just want you to have heard Actinobacterium and Firmicutes, so you've at least heard those names before. But I do want you to realize that the gram-positive bacteria are divided into two groups based on their amount of G's and C's in their DNA. So you can see that in this picture over here on the right. So that's what I want you to know about that for the test. Our first high GNC gram-positive bacteria are the Mycobacterium. A lot of these are found in the soil, and some of them can cause disease in people. So what's unique about the Mycobacterium is that they have that waxy mycolic acid layer that's outside of their cell wall, and so they're not able to be gram stained. So we have to stain them another way in order to see them, and so you can see this picture on the right. We've stained them with the acid-fast stain, and they stain red with the acid-fast stain. So to fill in our answer to our question here, stain used to see the Mycobacterium would be the acid-fast stain. Right, and if you try to grow these in culture in the lab, they're very slow growing, so it does take a while to get results back from the lab if you do a culture. There's two that we're going to talk about that cause disease in people. We have Mycobacterium tuberculosis that causes tuberculosis or TB. And unfortunately, we're having a lot of antibiotic resistance with Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and we'll talk about that one later. And then we also have Mycobacterium leprae, which we talked about before as the cause of leprosy. Another high GNC gram-positive bacterium is Corynebacterium diphtheriae, and that one's easy to remember. It causes diphtheria. And we hardly ever see this disease anymore because we've done a really good job with vaccinating people for it. But if you are unvaccinated and are exposed to the bacteria, what the bacteria does, it's spread through respiratory secretions, and it will infect the back of your throat area, and the bacteria will actually kill off the cells in the back of your throat, and those dead cells will form this thick leather-like mass of cells. And the word diphtheria means leather-like, and so it's just referring to this leather-like dead mass of cells in the back of your throat. So that's where the name came from. And that dead leather-like mass of cells in the back of your throat can block your airway and make it difficult to breathe. And then the other thing that makes it hard to breathe is if you look on the far right, your lymph nodes in your neck get very swollen. And so that also will make it hard to breathe as well. So between both of those, some patients actually needed to have tracheostomies in order to breathe. And so the nickname for diphtheria is they used to call it the strangler because it would, pretty much cut off your ability to breathe, and some people would suffocate. And then we'll talk about some of the other things that it can also do as well. The other thing is that it is kind of a strange shape. So in the middle here, we've got a picture of the Corynebacterium diphtheria bacteria. And the word Coryne, that means club-shaped. And you can see that this bacterium, it's a bacillus, but one end is a little bit swollen. So it's kind of a club-shaped. And so that's where the name Corynebacterium came from. All right, so now we're going to move on to the low GNC gram-positive bacteria. So this is looking at our low GNC gram-positive bacteria. So we're going to take a look at the Clostridium bacteria first. So these are interesting bacteria because they are obligate anaerobes. And remember, the word obligate means required. And anaerobe, an means without, and aerobe is talking about oxygen. So they're required not to have oxygen. And what that means is that they actually get killed by oxygen, and we'll explain why that is later. But they like to live in environments where there's no oxygen, like your intestines. And when they get pooped out, they actually will get killed when they're exposed to the air. So in order to survive, they will form endospores. And there's a picture on the bottom right of some endospores that have formed from these Clostridium bacteria. You can see these clear structures. That's an endospore. And then you can see the rest of the vegetative cell that hasn't disintegrated yet. But remember, the endospores are a dormant structure that allow the bacteria to survive until they get into a better environment, where then they will hatch back out into a living bacteria again, and then they do their thing and eat and reproduce and become the bacteria again. All right, so we have a couple of different species of Clostridium that will cause disease in people. Clostridium tetani, that one's easy. That one causes tetanus. And tetanus, what happens there is that the Clostridium tetani bacteria produce a toxin that will cause your muscles to contract uncontrollably. So they just keep contracting, contracting, contracting. They don't relax. And so you just get all rigid and stiff. And so that could kill you because your diaphragm keeps contracting and it doesn't relax, and you could actually suffocate. Okay, and then Clostridium botulinum, that one causes botulism. So we usually see that one with improperly canned foods. So that allows the Clostridium botulinum bacteria to grow. They don't get killed off. They grow in the canned food and they produce a toxin, and then you eat that food and ingest that, and then you can get botulism. And botulism is the opposite of tetanus. So the Clostridium botulinum bacteria produce a toxin that prevent your muscles from contracting. And so your muscles can't contract, and they're just all loose and floppy, and you're just paralyzed and you can't move. And you can die from that as well, because now your diaphragm can't contract at all. You can't breathe, and then you suffocate with that. Okay, and then we have Clostridium difficile, or C. diff, and that one causes diarrhea. And usually we'll see that in patients that have been on antibiotics, and that's wiped out some of the good bacteria in the microbiome, and that allows the C. diff to overgrow. And then our last one is Clostridium perfringens, and this one can contaminate food and produce a toxin, and then you eat the food and the toxin will cause some bad diarrhea. And then if it gets into a wound, so you can look at this really ugly leg on this patient, and what happened is this patient had a wound, the Clostridium perfringens got into the wound, and when you have a wound and there's not a good blood supply because of the damage, that's a great place for Clostridium to start growing because there's no oxygen. And it starts producing a toxin, and that starts killing off a lot of the tissue, and yeah, things get pretty ugly here. So this is, it produces what's called gas gangrene. And if you were to push on this patient's leg, the bacteria actually end up producing gas underneath the skin, and the skin, when you pushed on it, it would actually crackle because of the gas underneath. So if you ever have, a patient with this, and there's some other reasons, why you could get gas under the skin, but once you feel that, it's just such a weird feeling, you won't forget it. So that's Clostridium perfringens. And they're probably getting ready here to do surgery. I'm not sure if this patient kept their leg, or they might have had to just go in and clean out all of that dead tissue and let it heal. So not sure what happened there. Okay, and then we have bacillus. So this is another low GNC gram-positive bacteria. And remember that the two bacteria that I want you to remember that produce endospores would be Clostridium and bacillus. So you can see on this picture on the right, we've got the Bacillus anthracis bacteria. And you can see these clear structures inside the bacteria, and there's a few clear structures that have already been released there, and those are all endospores. And so bacillus, again, doesn't like oxygen, and so in order to survive, when it gets pooped out, it will form these endospores until it gets into a better environment where there's no oxygen again, and then it can hatch back out and form the bacteria again. And Bacillus anthracis, that one's easy to remember. It causes a very scary disease, anthrax. And then we have Staphylococcus. So Staphylococcus aureus forms these grape-like clusters over here on the right. And Staphylococcus aureus can cause a number of different types of problems in people depending on where it gets in the body. So if it gets into a wound, it can cause skin infections. If it contaminates food and you leave the food out for too long, and the Staph aureus produces an enterotoxin, remember entero means intestines, and then you come along later and then eat that food and ingest that toxin, you can get food poisoning. So you get some bad vomiting and diarrhea from that. We can also see Staphylococcus aureus causing toxic shock syndrome, and that was made famous by the tampons. This was a number of years ago. They fixed this problem, but they had these super absorbent tampons, and Staph aureus had gotten on them and were releasing toxins, getting into the woman's bloodstream, and that was causing this toxic shock syndrome, and some women died from that. And then we do have some antibiotic resistance problems with Staphylococcus aureus. So remember that Staphylococcus aureus is one of our escape pathogens. So it's the S in escape. And so the antibiotic resistance that we do have, one example there is MRSA, the methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. Okay, and now we're going to take a look at some other low GNC gram-positive bacteria. We'll look at just the Streptococcus and Enterococcus. Streptococcus is obviously going to be a chain of cocci, which you can see on this picture on the right. They're a very large and diverse group. There's a lot of different species of Streptococcus bacteria. There's two classification systems that are used to classify them. The first one is the hemolytic groups. And then the second one is the Lancefield groups. I think these get a little bit confusing, so we'll explain them first and then we'll kind of put everything together on the next slide. So let's start with the hemolytic groups. So how they came up with these is that when you grow the Streptococcus bacteria on blood agar, which is just a culture media that they've added red blood cells to, we get some different patterns of hemolysis of the red blood cells. So the alpha hemolytic strep, they're going to partially hemolyze the red blood cells. So you can see the alpha hemolytic strep here on the top left. They've turned the blood agar kind of a greenish color. So that's what you get when you partially break down or partially hemolyze the red blood cells. The next group, the beta hemolytic strep, they're going to completely hemolyze the red blood cells. So you can see over here on the far right that the blood agar has turned pretty clear. So they have completely broken down the red blood cells. And then the last group would be the gamma hemolytic strep, or sometimes they're also called non-hemolytic strep. And that's on the bottom here. So the gamma hemolytic strep, they're not going to hemolyze the red blood cells at all. And so there's no change in color in the blood agar at all. And then these Lancefield groups, it's just named after the scientist that came up with this. What she did was that she noticed in the beta hemolytic group of strep, there were some different strains that the immune system acted differently to. And so she was able to identify those. So she just took the beta hemolytic strep and gave them some different letters. And so we have some of the human pathogens that are going to be in the group A and group B in the Lancefield groups. So here I've just kind of put everything together with the two classification systems that are used with Streptococcus just to try to hopefully make it a little bit more clear. So I've got the hemolytic groups. So alpha hemolytic strep, remember, is going to partially hemolyze the red blood cells. So it'll turn kind of a greenish color on the blood agar. And then beta hemolytic strep is going to completely hemolyze the red blood cells. So it'll turn the blood agar clear. And the beta hemolytic strep we can further categorize into these Lancefield groups, either group A or group B strep. So the group A strep, which sometimes they just abbreviate GAS, the example there is Streptococcus pyogenes, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then the group B strep, or GBS, would be the abbreviation there, is Streptococcus agalactiae. And then the gamma hemolytic strep, or non-hemolytic strep, there's going to be no hemolysis or no breakdown of the red blood cells on the blood agar. And so there'll be no change in color at all on the blood agar with this kind of hemolytic strep. So I would know these for the exam. So this is pretty important. So there probably will be a question on this, just kind of a definition. If I describe it, you can pick out, what kind of hemolytic strep it might be. All right, so let's take a look at our streptococcus. Looking at the beta hemolytic strep first. We've got Streptococcus pyogenes, which is an example of group A strep. And Streptococcus pyogenes, most famously, is the cause of strep throat. And so you can see that over here on the left. And I'm sure that all of us have probably had strep throat at some point. And so you get that really bad sore throat, it's really red back there. And then a lot of times people will get these little white patches in the back of their throat, but not always. And what those white patches are little pockets of pus. And so that's where the name pyogenes comes from. So pyo means pus, and gen means to produce. So that's kind of gross. All right, Streptococcus pyogenes, besides causing strep throat, if it gets into a cut in the skin, can also cause skin infections. It can also cause scarlet fever. This is just a rash that we can sometimes see that goes along with someone that has strep throat. They can also get a rash on their skin. And then we can also see rheumatic fever, which we'll talk about as a complication that we can see after someone's had strep throat. We don't see it very often, but sometimes we do. And the immune system gets a little confused in fighting off the Streptococcus pyogenes, and it starts attacking parts of the body like your heart valves. So that can cause some heart damage, for example. Streptococcus agalactiae, or group B strep, is a concern, especially in pregnant mothers. So this bacteria can live in the vagina, but it's not always there. It kind of comes and goes. And they will test mothers before delivery to see if the bacteria is there, and if it is, they will give mom antibiotics at the time of delivery to make sure that she doesn't pass this to the newborn during a vaginal delivery, because if the newborn picks up this bacteria and it gets into the baby's lungs, it can cause pneumonia. If it gets into the bloodstream, it can cause sepsis, which is pretty serious and could kill the baby. And then it could also get into the meninges and cause meningitis as well. And then just some examples of non-beta hemolytic strep. You don't need to memorize that they're non-beta hemolytic strep, just don't worry about that. But we have Streptococcus pneumoniae, and that one's easy to remember. It's a cause of pneumococcal pneumonia. We worry about that in kids and older people, and there is a pneumococcal pneumonia vaccine to protect people against that. And then if you're going into dentistry, Streptococcus mutans, that is a cause of cavities. So you can see this tooth over here has a rather large cavity in it that was caused by Streptococcus mutans. Our next low GNC gram-positive bacteria is Enterococcus, and looking at the name, we have entero. So remember that means intestines. So it's going to be normally living in the GI tract. And remember that Enterococcus is one of our escape pathogens. And being one of the escape pathogens, antibiotic resistance is going to be a problem with this bacteria. And also it can cause some infections in hospitalized patients. So it can cause these nosocomial or healthcare associated infections. So maybe it gets into a surgery wound, it can cause UTIs, so it can cause some problems. Okay, and then our last gram-positive bacteria we're going to be talking about is Mycoplasma pneumoniae. And this one is a bit unusual. It does not have a cell wall, and it's the smallest bacteria that we know of so far. So you can see in the picture where this black arrow is, it's pointing to one of the Mycoplasma pneumoniae, and there's actually quite a few of the Mycoplasma pneumoniae kind of all throughout here. And this bigger cell here, that's one of our white blood cells, so you can kind of see the size difference. And Mycoplasma pneumoniae is so small you can't see it with a light microscope. You have to use an electron microscope. And because it doesn't have a cell wall, it's going to vary in shape or be pleomorphic. So the disease that it causes in people would be pneumonia, and that's pretty easy to remember because of the name.